This is the 1/10 scale Arma Raider, and this is the first RC car Arma ever came out with. Sort of. We'll get into that in a little bit. This car has some features in it that many manufacturers didn't come out with till years later, and I'm really excited to tear this thing down and then see what it can do. As you can see, this is a 2-wheel-drive 1/10 scale buggy. It came in a few different flavors. This is the slightly updated BLS brushless version. The wheels are using some nice serrated hex nuts that are a little bit shorter than normal. These tires are branded Dboots. These are the Sand Scorpion DBs. They are foam filled and are on 12mm hexes. So where did the Dboots brand and where did the Arma brand for that matter come from? Well, it all starts with a guy named Jason Dearden. He got interested in RC at the age of 12, and as an adult in 1992, he started his own RC distribution company. As you can see, these rear tires are also Dboots, and these are also labeled Sand Scorpion DB. After some success in RC distribution, Dearden was approached by HPI in 1998 to create HPI's Europe branch, and he worked with HPI for 10 years. Now, as you can see here, we've got a fairly standard looking setup. We've got plastic hexes here, some fairly standard looking stub shafts with shielded bearings that don't appear to be branded, and we've also got plastic hexes here in the front, again with shielded bearings. The bodywork on this buggy does not have any quick release system. This chassis was designed to have the battery load from the bottom. Unlike the new Gorgon platform, this actually uses a pin, which of course could get lost. However, as you can see, this body clip was actually retained, and that was a rare feature back then. Opening this up, you can see we've got plenty of room in here for a 2S battery and some nice padding to go with that. While Dearden was working with HPI, a company from Taiwan acquired Team Durango, and in 2008, after Dearden and HPI parted ways, they weren't seeing eye to eye on some things apparently. He started working with that company, and together, they founded Arma. Speaking of development, with this body off, you can see we have a slightly updated version of the Raider here. The original version actually had twin metal vertical plates, interestingly, just like HPI did on some of their vehicles. This has a plastic monocoque chassis, but other than that small change in the chassis, most of what you're going to see here is going to be identical to that original version. The only other difference is going to be the power system, and we'll take a closer look at that in just a second as well. Speaking of releases, the Raider was originally released in 2011. One really cool thing is you can actually go back and look at videos from Arma's YouTube channel, including one for the original Raider. Check this out. One thing I'm impressed with on this car is just how soft most of these plastics still feel. This car is over a decade old, and a lot of times plastic can get brittle, but this one still feels pretty good. Removing the wing should let us get this cage out of here. As you can see, the cage is held in with a screw and a little tab on each one of these locations for extra strength, and all of these screws are hex head. Underneath that, we can see the ESC. This is actually the brushless BLS version, but the original brush version would have had an ESC in the same place. We've also got a motor here in the rear. We'll take a closer look at that in a minute, and that ESC has a really nice looking switch on it that appears to be waterproof, and this looks like it was made by Hobbywing based on the set button here, though it's definitely not one I'm familiar with. You can see down in here, though, that this has been waterproofed, and this looks like a waterproof receiver box, too, though the design looks pretty familiar to me, and it makes me wonder if Arma was already starting to get themselves in trouble. Not long after the original Raider was released, Arma, Axial, and Team Durango were all acquired by Hobbyco. Around that same time, Hobbyco started buying a lot of different brands and spending a lot of money, which may have led them to some trouble in the future. Just 2 screws removes this slipper clutch cover. Interestingly, it says slipper clutch set at factory, do not adjust. This cover feels very interesting. It's very thin and doesn't really seem to have the same quality as the rest of the parts. Underneath that cover, it looks like we've got a 32P plastic spur gear. And yeah, this actually doesn't look like it's adjustable. We'll have to take a closer look at that. After being acquired by Team Durango, Arma released several other vehicles on this same platform, including some names you'll definitely be familiar with, such as the Mojave, the Fury, the Vortex, although Vortex was spelled differently at the time, as well as the 2-wheel drive Granite. Okay, so we've just got a standard slipper clutch under here, so this cover is really just to stop you from adjusting it. That's really interesting. I don't think I've ever seen any other brand do that, and I guess Arma was really trying to protect us from ourselves. Arma was definitely releasing some cool videos back then. While I get this motor out, check out the waterproof testing they were doing. These motor screws are actually pretty interesting. You can see they have an unusually wide head on them, and that's to accommodate the fact that they're bearing against plastic here. Standard head screws would dig into the plastic, which can be a problem and has been on other brands. This brushless system came at a time when brushless wasn't really that common, and as you can see, this motor was designed to mimic a brushed motor so it would fit where brushed motors would. We do have a bearing in the front and rear, though this can has been crimped together so we can't get inside it to take a closer look at it. This motor is 4,000 kV, it is a 2-pole brushless motor, and I'm really curious to see how this thing handles some bashing, which we're definitely going to be doing in a few minutes. To take a closer look at the internal workings of this transmission, we're going to have to pull this rear module off. While I'm doing that, take a look at what Arma introduced in 2015. Seeing those first generation tires and body on the Kraton really brings me back. What was the first version Kraton that you ever got? I think mine was V3. Now, speaking of old designs, removing this rear module to get to the rear differential definitely is the first time this thing hasn't felt thoroughly modern. As you can see, we've already removed a lot of screws and we've got more to go. We also see something we will probably never see on an Arma again, and that's these ball cups. They work okay, but they do tend to pop off, and I'll be curious to see if they pop off during bashing. And with that, we've finally got that module free. Let's see what this rear differential looks like. Around the same time in 2015 when they released the Kraton, they also released the Talion, the Typhon, and Centon. All names we're pretty familiar with. The Centon has since been discontinued, but the rest of them are still around. Okay, I think we finally got this apart. By my count, it took 27 screws and 2 clips. That's definitely not what you would see in a modern Arma. However, something you would see in a modern Arma is the use of wide plastic gears. This is a pretty similar setup to what we see in a modern Gorgon platform, and it's a great way for them to save money by not using metal gears while still having a very strong setup. Let's see what the inside of this rear diff looks like. Now, the next release from Arma is the one that would nearly result in their complete downfall, and that's the Arma Nero, as well as the Phazon and Big Rock. I have an entire video showing everything about the Nero, as well as detailing what happened in that. But briefly, Traxxas didn't like some of the designs that they were using in the Nero, as they did technically violate some of their patents, though those were patents for things that Traxxas really didn't come up with, and there's definitely some controversy as to whether or not they should have even been able to sue for it. We're going to talk a bit more about the timing of that lawsuit in a minute, because there's something on the chassis of this car that I find very interesting. Speaking of interesting, let's pop this open, and it looks like we have a standard sealed differential in here. There's only 2 spider gears, which isn't nearly as strong as having 4. This is grease filled. We do have a gasket here. Let's see if we've got O-rings. Okay, I can't get this off, and I don't really want to force it because these parts can be kind of hard to come by, but looking at the exploded view here, you can see that this does have an O-ring in it, so this is a sealed differential that you could put oil in if you wanted to. I'm not terribly surprised to see grease here, as grease was pretty common for differentials back when this was made. Now, around the same time that the Nero, Phazon, and Big Rock were introduced, Hobbyco was starting to get themselves into some real financial trouble, and they owed a lot of people a lot of money, and I think Traxxas smelled blood in the water, so they went ahead and sued them for some patent issues, and Traxxas won those lawsuits. Around the same time Traxxas won those lawsuits, Hobbyco filed for bankruptcy, and then Horizon bought Hobbyco along with all the brands they owned, including Arma. Let's see just how modern Arma's first shock absorber was. These are all plastic shocks that use spacers for preload. Just got a standard spring perch here. And then removing the shock cap, we can see we're just using a standard O-ring here. We don't have a bleeder up here, but this is an emulsion style shock. You can see they put a little notch in the threads. So as you close this up, you can tighten it almost all the way down, then push the shock shaft up, then tighten it down the rest of the way, and that'll let most of the air out. It's not ideal, but it will work. And to the shock designer's credit, none of these shocks are leaking. Now let's see what passed for an RTR servo almost 15 years ago. All right, pulling this cover off. Get a decent look at the servo in here. Looks like it might just pull straight up and out. Again, we've got a ball link here, which we would never see on a modern Arma. And there we go, the ADS5 waterproof servo. Let's see what's inside. We can see we do have O-rings on the screws. I kind of miss the red color of these Arma servos, though I don't miss how weak they were. Looking inside, we've got a very basic servo in here with an O-ring for waterproofing. And then just taking a peek under the top here, we can see we've got all plastic gears in there. I suspect this servo might not last too long, especially given its age, but we'll find out when we bash it. I'm gonna put this together, then we'll take a look at that potential patent issue. Now, the last thing we need to look at before we bash this thing is perhaps the most interesting, and that's this receiver box. The reason this is so interesting is because the receiver box is one of the main things that Traxxas sued Hobbyco over on the Arma Nero. Yet, by all appearances, it looks like this receiver box, which was designed much, much earlier, probably violated that exact same patent, yet Traxxas decided not to take action at this time. Popping this cover off, yeah, we can see that this is essentially exactly a Traxxas receiver box. This has the same exact seal that they patented with a gasket that the wires go through that are patented. So this would have violated the same patent that Traxxas sued Hobbyco for, yet they chose not to with this model. I guess they didn't yet see Arma as a threat, or they didn't see the parent company as weak enough to sue. In here, we have the basic ARX 100 receiver. Connected to that, we have the ATX 100 transmitter. This is a decent looking transmitter. You can see how old it is based on its extendable antenna. This is 2.4 gigahertz though, which not all cars back then had, and it only took 4 AA batteries, which again, a lot of transmitters at this time took 8 AA batteries, so this was fairly advanced for the time. Speaking of advanced for the time, let's get this thing together and see just how good it was. If you're enjoying watching this, you're definitely not going to want to miss the next video, so make sure you get subscribed, hit that bell to get notified, because it's going to be a good one. So how does Arma get around this receiver box patent now? Well, they still have a box, it still has a gasket and a lid, but instead of clamping the wires down like they do in this version and like in the Traxxas patent, there's a slit in the side of the box that a seal goes in and the wires pass through that slit. That's how silly these patents can be. It's almost exactly the same design, but they made a small change to it just to avoid the patent. This kind of thing happens all the time in industry, and it doesn't really benefit anybody. We'll go ahead and put this adjustment discourager on for now. This ESC is only capable of 2S, and I'm guessing it's probably going to be pretty slow, kind of like the new Traxxas BL2S system is. But if it is, I've got a 3S ESC we can try that might wake this thing up. After Horizon acquired all the Hobbyco brands, Arma entered what I would consider its more modern phase, and I think most of you are familiar with the modern history of Arma. This is when they brought out their 3S vehicles, their 4S vehicles, made several updates to the 6S line, brought out those 8S trucks, and more recently brought out the Groms, as well as the Gorgon and its associated trucks. But whatever happened to Jason Dearden? Well, let's see how this thing does, and I'll let you know when we get back. Now here's something definitely worth noting. I was doing a final inspection of this before taking it out, and I noticed that these pieces here were loose. I tried to put a screw in from the back, but there's no room, and it turns out this is not installed correctly. This should not have 2 screws from the front. It should have screws from the back and then nuts on the front, very similar to the way it is in the back here. Whenever you buy a used car, remember, you're buying someone else's used car, and there's a chance they've done some stuff, and some of that stuff might not be right. Obviously, we want this bracing, and these screws might not hold these shocks in correctly, so let's fix this. That's much better. I'm gonna do the other side. Let's drop a beefy 2S battery in this thing and see what she can do. Hang on a second. Unfortunately, that battery's not gonna fit. And that brings me to a really interesting point about these older cars. This was designed in a time when LiPo batteries really weren't that popular yet, and everybody was using nickel metal hydride batteries. As you can see here, those nickel metal hydride cells were all basically the same size, which made the battery packs the same size, so they made battery trays to fit those packs. This is in stark contrast to today, where manufacturers know we're gonna be putting bigger batteries in here, so they make the trays way oversized to give you plenty of room to put whatever battery you want in them. There is one manufacturer that's still using proprietary battery tray sizes, but most manufacturers give you lots of room. Fortunately, I do have one LiPo battery that will just barely fit in here. The lid doesn't quite close all the way, but we can make it work, so now let's go see what this thing can do. All right, let's see how fast this old girl is. That's peppier than I thought it would be. Feels nice and stable. Braking's interesting, as always, with two-wheel drive. One more pass. All right, let's bring it in. All right, 33 miles an hour. That's actually faster than I was expecting on 2S. Let's see if this old girl can survive some bashing. actually held up a lot better than I thought it would. It definitely doesn't handle as well as a modern two-wheel drive vehicle does, but it handled better than I thought it would, and it actually jumped pretty well, assuming the only trick you want to do is a single front flip, because it does that really well, but not much else. And unfortunately on that last crash, we did take some damage. The rear wing mount here is broken, but more importantly, we broke a rear hub. That's not terribly surprising. This is an old vehicle. Those were some pretty big jumps, and that was a pretty bad landing. Overall, I'm actually pretty impressed with how this thing held up. And surprisingly, parts are still readily available for this. I can get the rear wing mount and this hub on Amazon, and it'll be here in a few days. I kind of expected parts to be a little harder to get for something that's this old, and it was really nice to see that they were available. So do you guys want to see a Raider on the new Gorgon platform? Do you want to see more videos like this? Let me know down in the comments. Oh, and Jason Dearden, he's doing just fine. He's actually been working for Horizon since 2009 and is the managing director of Horizon UK. As a matter of fact, he's probably watching one of these videos right now.